Welcome to TSI's first webinar of 2025. Today, our topic is air quality and wildfires, understanding the impact. We are fortunate to have a special guest, Mike Giordano. Mike and I have worked together in the past while he was affiliated with AFRICET in Ghana.
Yeah,
so a brief overview and introduction of your career.
Yeah, so Mike Giordano, thanks for having me on here, John. As you said, I've been working in the low-cost sensor space kind of recently, although right now I'm actually a research scientist at UC Berkeley. But I've been in air quality and atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric physics for almost a decade now, kind of all over the gamut, but a lot of field work in parts of the global south, all over the US and the global north. And yeah, excited to be here.
That sounds great. We have a few topics to touch on, so I briefly want to go over the loose agenda. We're going to talk about just some general information about wildfire season, talk specifically on the recent fire in Southern California, the impacts on air quality, both during wildfires, post fires. And then we're going to dive into a little bit about some of the work that you've done, Mike, we'll talk about the Berkeley van that you've shared some information. I'm excited to hear more detail. We'll focus on air quality measurement, a case study that you've mentioned, focusing on VOCs, overall worldwide monitoring, and finish up with AFRICET and some of the work that you've done there. Does that sound like a good plan and agenda?
Sounds great.
Perfect. Okay. So wildfire season, typically between spring and fall. In the US, primary is impact by in the West Coast in Canada. Some of the causes, there are environmental factors. Dry conditions, drought and hot weather can create a drier, more flammable environment. Winds, strong winds can spread fires quickly, making them difficult to manage. And also higher temperatures throughout the summer typically can increase drought frequency. There are some natural causes, most commonly like lightning strikes that could ignite debris, especially in hot and dry environments. Human factors also play a role in wildfires, at least the start of wildfires. Unattended campfires, failure to clean up or distinguish your fire can lead to the start and spread of fire. Discarded matches, cigarettes that seem to be burned out but can still reignite debris. That can be an issue. Overall burning debris, sparks from burning trash or leaves can also spread. And equipment malfunction is another area where the friction, the heat, sparks from lawnmowers, any type of equipment can ignite the vegetation and cause the start of a wildfire, which we all know how that could spread. I'm sure you all are aware, earlier in this year, there was a devastating fire in Southern California. I believe it was mid-January is when it started. The cause of the fire is still under investigation. And at this time, an exact cause can't be confirmed are you aware of any confirmation of the exact causes, Mike, at this time?
No. I do remember it actually started January 7th. It was really early in the year.
Yes. And there are some theories that are being followed now about the potential causes. There was a prior fire called the Lackman Fire. It was a small bushfire that burned about eight acres prior to being contained. And it could be possible that some embers from that fire could have started the Palisades fire, and in the early stages might have went undetected. That could have led to the bigger fire as the end result. There has been verification of down power lines, and it was confirmed that active power lines were down in the area prior to that fire, so that could potentially be a source. And the overall combination of drought and the Santa Ana wind conditions were present prior to the fire. So again, these are just theories, but right now they're part of the investigation to try to identify what was the source. And obviously, knowing that we could potentially take steps to prevent a devastating fire like we just saw and witnessed.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, right, that
Sure.
this was the driest 9-month period on record for, I don't remember how much of Southern California, but for sure the area that the fire happened in. And that shouldn't go understated, right? Like this is very part of the reason that this was so bad is that the drought has been so intense for this area.
And is that, when you mentioned 9 months, are we expected to see that in the middle of summer, not as early in January or February?
I mean, as someone who did their PhD and spent some time in Southern California, right? Winter should be a rainy period.
Fair enough.
Granted, I also
Yeah.
did start in the middle of a drought myself when I was there. So I mean, it's not something that's uh, uncommon for there to be drought conditions in this part of the world. But you know, this is a 9-month continuous period, almost a full year, where it was the driest period on record, right? And I
Okay.
don't actually know if we're 3 months past this. I actually don't know if we are at a full year of the driest conditions ever on record or not. This is something I should look into.
Well, definitely we can see the result of an extended period like that and what
Yeah.
is possible that happen. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Moving on, impacts on air quality during the fire or a fire in general. Um, Outdoor smoke particles, PM 2.5, most common measurement, are released into the air. Carbon monoxide can reach dangerous levels near the fire. VOCs, volcanic organic compounds, can lead to ozone forming at the ground level. Other gases like NOx, nitrous oxides, contribute to respiratory issues and smog. And something that I really didn't consider before is during a wildfire, reduced visibility can cause a lot of problems, accidents, just poor visibility in general makes it very difficult environment to be present in. Indoor particles can get indoors if the building's homes are not properly sealed off. HVAC systems can pull outdoor air. I would like to think that with new ASHRAE standards, we have these different types of modes now where it provides a safer and in a cleaner environment. It is referred to as a pandemic mode. So this would portray. I did read that in most homes, standard AC is the only filtration that's occurring, and that's bringing in fresh air from outside. So all of this during elevated pollution or when there is a fire present or smoke present can have a very negative impact on your indoor as well. Moving on, impacts on air quality after the fire. We talked about fine particulates or PM 2.5. Smoke particles can stay suspended in the air long after the fire ends. And I assume that's some of the research that you've been doing, Mike. We can touch on that when we talk about the van. Winds continue to stir up ash, soot, debris, reintroducing them to the air past the time of the fire being contained. Ash fallout can settle on surfaces outside, inside your home and areas. The cleanup can go on for a long period of time. especially if it's dry and windy, can re-release particles into the air. And after an event like this, there is always a presence of dust, toxins that are used through everyday practices like sweeping, cleaning, leaf blowers, things that people are doing to fix and get back or remediate, can also contribute still to the dust and toxins that are still in the air. Odors and off-gassing, walls, carpets, furniture, HVAC systems can absorb smoke and release it slowly over periods of time. And it could take weeks or months for indoor air to fully clear without proper steps and purification.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is one of those things that we tend to not really think about, right? Is the effects of the aftermath, right? The cleanup effects in these kinds of situations. You see this all the time in areas that have been flooded, right? And exactly what the cleanup is very, very visible, and the impacts of it are very visible for floods. But for fires, right? If you are downwind from a large complex or a large building that is being cleaned up, especially if it's older, right? Um, there might be a lot of things that are getting re-emitted and relofted downwind to you, right? In the U.S. we've been pretty good about like asbestos remediation, but there are still buildings that have it, and if those get burned down and those are now getting uh, rummaged through for cleanup purposes, then those things are going to get lofted and resuspended in the air and can have real impacts downwind.
So the actual condition of the building that is burned or has just been destroyed has an impact on the level of pollutants that are going into the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. There is another group here at UC Berkeley who I could get you the name in a little bit. Basically, they are building small houses in and burning them, right? And to look specifically at the emissions of, what happens when you have like sofas and furniture and certain types of insulation and other types of materials, beyond just the wood or the brick or the cinder block that make up uh, you know a, a house, right? A
Mhm.
building. um, and yeah, some of the results are pretty crazy about what actually gets released during that. And of course, that doesn't just happen in a vacuum when it's burned. It's also after the fact.
That's good to know. And yes, I've witnessed some controlled burns, and they're happening all over the country. It's important to really understand that it goes just beyond the brick and mortar of the building, that it can be hazardous and harmful. So yeah, I would like to learn more about that group and what their findings are. Right. The Berkeley van. So Mike, we've talked about this a few times. Can you give us an overview of the van that you, I believe, have built and break down some of the objectives of building this?
Yeah. So obviously, this is not just me in a vacuum. I'm working with a great professor here, Josh Apty, and an amazing postdoc, Samuel Cliff. And we have really, those two have really been sort of the driving impetus, and I've kind of joined on a little bit later to help sort some of these like inlet issues and instrument working issues. And then also as well, I'll shout out our kind of tech guru, Robin Weber, who's built a lot of the like software infrastructure for this. But yeah, so basically, there's this kind of idea. Uh, you can have fixed monitoring, right? So this
Mhm.
is what TSI does on both sides of its business. You can have the reference monitors and reference sensors that are more expensive, and you get a couple of them in an area, or you can get like the lower cost sensors, and you get more of them in an area. But generally speaking, right, you're not actually moving around with them. this comes with a big asterisk, right? There are people who are like putting these things on drones and whatever.
Sure.
But there's this kind of other modality of air quality and atmospheric science research that's come around really in about the past 10 years, really kind of coincident with these kind of low and lower cost monitors, um, of basically putting instruments in a moving vehicle and then driving that vehicle around. Um, let me also make sure to preface this. People have been putting instruments in planes for a lot longer, right? And those are those are a different thing. But ground-based vehicles, hasn't the infrastructure to do that hasn't really existed for all that long. But that's what we're trying to do here, right? So we have this van, and you can see on the right side basically what it looks like, and on the left side kind of a schematic for all of the instruments that we have, right? So we're measuring a bunch of particle phase stuff, black carbon, PM 2.5, PM 10, the ultrafine particles through a couple of sizing mechanisms. We're measuring pretty much all of the uh, most important gas phase species, ozone, NOx, NO and NO2, as well as methane and ethane, which I think I'll talk about a little bit later. But you can think of natural gas leaks and natural gas pumps for why this is important. And like piping infrastructure inside cities, as well as this VOCs, so these organic compounds, and really it's just kind of like gas phase compounds in general that we're measuring through a focus. So we're driving around this van, and if you compare this to this other modality of like fixed site sensors, these fixed site sensors have this continuous temporal resolution, right? They are measuring every second of every hour of every day for as long as they're on. But they're measuring for, some area, some spatial area that their coverage is determined by, like where they're placed and what the meteorological conditions are, right? But when you can drive around, you get rid of that limitation, right? So now we can measure pretty much any spatial area that we can physically access with a van, right? So any road, and we can get measurements at every second at the same kind of temporal resolution. And so we can, drive around at uh, 10 feet per second or so, 5 feet per second or so, um, and get these extremely high density uh, spatial density maps of what concentrations look like, right? And then there's like this whole discussion about how does this translate into like average concentration, since this like temporal element is transient, and we're not doing the same thing as what these fixed site monitors are. But the real strength of this is being able to really pinpoint where emissions are coming from, right? And that can be emissions of whatever species of interest we happen to find. And of course, in like a various area, there might be different point sources of different species that we can identify, and we can like, really get a handle on.
Mhm. So you're actually isolating the source through this as opposed to an air monitoring network that's stationary, is just
Yeah.
basically providing data for the general area where you could actually pinpoint specifically. Now, do you lead towards, you start to get high readings and try to navigate towards them as well? Is this sort of like a navigational study as well, or are you just randomly choosing a path?
Uh, this is, I'll say this. So the project that we're on right now is with this is basically a California Air Resources Board project.
Mhm.
And we're subcontracted out through it. And part of our duty is to make these sort of average concentration maps, right? So that means that we are driving every single road in a community, right? And specifically, we're doing that multiple times, aiming for at least 8 passes, because statistically, if you do basically a road 8 times, you get sort of the average, the mean concentration that on that road, right? There's a whole bunch of research into why that's true. I would encourage people to go look up, particularly Josh Apte's paper that he did this with Google Street View cars a few years ago. So no, it's not our main focus to do that, but that is one of the cool things about this project and about this sort of measurement modality, is that once everything else is done, right? If we go and we look at that data and we're like, oh, there's, a hotspot of whatever, styrene is a weird example that we've been finding recently. Like, oh, there's a styrene hotspot around here. Let's try and, let's go do another couple of passes and see if we can identify where that is, if
Mhm.
that's, a continuous emitter, or if there's, like a temporal pattern to it, right? It's only on during business hours, or it's only on at night, that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, thank you. I look forward to seeing the results of this, and it's exciting that steps like this can be taken, and to really get a true understanding of where the potential hazards and where these harmful pollutants and gases are being emitted. Focus areas. Do you want to walk us through this slide?
Yeah. So this was kind of so originally this slide was sort of about my background and sort of like what I've done. Um,
Yes.
but this is also, I think, super relevant to the work that I will be doing as well, because there's a lot of overlap in, again, in this new mobile measurement modality versus basically stationary and um, fixed site and source characterization stuff that I've done in the past, right? Um, yeah, so basically, there's a few other types of modalities in atmospheric science for getting data, right? One is chamber studies, so you isolate whatever you want to measure, right? In my case, it was actually biomass burning of a lot of the shrubbery that is in Southern California. It was chamise and manzanita. These are the uh, two species of plants that pretty much dominate the hills. That the Santa Ana fire and the Palisades fire were, uh, you know, raging on, right? Um, and so I was looking at that for my PhD about like how the emissions from those plants specifically form clouds and form droplets, and how that has like what climate impacts that can have, just because these two plants are like very widespread across the Southwest US. um, and then there's a lot of other stuff on here that I've done. It's like near source characterization, right? So this is this idea of taking a suite of instruments and putting it next to a source that can't be moved or can't be reproduced in a chamber, right? Like, it's easy to take um uh I don't know, some volatile organic compound and ozone and put it in a chamber, right? It's a lot harder to get, for example, a brick kiln and put that directly into a chamber, right? And
Yes.
get the measurements from those into a chamber. Um, So one thing that we can do, right, is we can take all these expensive instruments, put them near smokestacks, and actually characterize those emissions, and then use those like characterized measurements to inform our sort of broader scale measurements, right? Our fixed site measurements that are measuring where these actual emitters might be located, right?
Mhm.
And to kind of back out the actual impact that each of these fixed sites can have on or each of these particular emitters can have on a broad general area. Um, and then, again, kind of in this idea of like general area monitoring, doing this with both these same kinds of like high cost instruments in limited point source uh, placement for, you can't have 100 instruments of $100,000 cost each because that's a lot. That's a lot of
Yes.
money to deploy in one area.
Yes.
But obviously that's is helped to be alleviated by low cost and lower cost monitors. Okay, and so the if you think about this in global terms, right? How does this kind of play into this mobile monitoring framework? And I think it's relatively, clear to see that, right? We get this idea of near source characterization when we want to, right? We can again drive to a place that is a high emitter of something
Mhm.
that we know or something that we just noticed and saw, and we can characterize it fully. Um, and we can go around the whole area that that particular emitter might impact and really do things like measure how does a how does a species being emitted evolve in the real world, right? So this is something that we measure often in chambers, right?
Mhm.
We put something in a chamber, we throw some lights on to do photochemistry, um, and then we take that and like try and measure that with planes and fixed light monitoring downwind. But now we can do this with a van, right? And I think on the next slide there's actually a pretty good uh, um, photo of this. Is it
We could
slide
jump
10?
to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is just preliminary data, right? So we were driving around the van in West Oakland. And so on the left here is basically a graph of this is methane, right? So this is particularly methane. And you can see we've marked where there's a wastewater treatment plant, which is a very known emitter of methane. And you can see where the plume of that wastewater treatment plant is, right? And it's how it's impacting this local community in West Oakland, right? Uh, and if you drive around, like this is not industrial area only, right? There's a lot of houses and a lot of people that are breathing in this methane and the other VOCs from this wastewater treatment plant every day, right? Um, and just to like kind of get at your point of like what are we doing? Um, this was us randomly driving around for testing purposes, and we noticed, oh, look, if we do this kind of transect, you see no methane, higher methane, high methane, high methane, high methane, lower, 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 none, right? So you get this
Mhm.
this nice curve
Mhm.
of transecting the plume. Um, and then so we're like, okay, let's do this as much as possible, and let's like actually try and map out where this plume is going and how it is evolving, right? So that's kind of what this right side is. This is um, just sort of the average VOC concentrations, right? So uh, basically these volatile organic compounds um, for this plume. But instead of just doing this average, right, we can look at the VOC concentration at the beginning of this plume. So like near the red dot uh, where the wastewater treatment plant is, where it's like a very fresh emission. And then all the way on the other side of it, going eastward at the sort of end of the plume where it's more dissipated.
Yes.
And uh, how does the ratio of the various with that distance, right? And does that match our understanding of our models that we have? Uh, And if it doesn't, where is that mismatch exactly? Is it, are we missing some mechanisms in the models? Are we missing other like emission sources of some of these VOCs, like in that path, or um, otherwise contributing to that plume? Or is it, something else entirely? So yeah, it's there's some really cool questions and some really cool uh, things that we can get with this type of measurement platform.
Mike, if you were just to be present in this area, is this something that you physically would experience, smell, feeling? How does that translate into just general exposure in that area for an hour, a day, a week?
Yeah. The short answer to that is yeah, you notice like methane at these concentrations, right? You can smell it.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not qualified to speak about the like health impacts of what this does and that kind of stuff. So I will beg off that part of the question.
Mhm.
Um, but I will say, that does kind of bring up this part of the part of the reason that we're doing all this, right? Part of the reason that uh, California Resources Board has made um, this request to make these kinds of like community maps is because there are uh, in California what's called these consistently nominated communities. Basically, you have AB 617, which defined the most polluted and the most impacted from air pollution neighborhoods and areas in the state, and then you have consistently nominated communities, which are right above that, right, and like maybe could be considered or maybe shouldn't be considered AB 617, right? Um, and so part of that is because you have people in these kinds of communities who are like, oh, it always smells bad on,
Mhm.
you know, Monday through Thursday, right? Like in this community, it's just there's something that smells bad, or uh, there's, higher levels of asthma or COPD or something like this in this area. Um, and, getting at uh, specific causes can be really difficult without these kinds of measurements.
Mhm. Okay. All right. That's thank you for that thorough explanation, Mike. Um, let's pivot over to worldwide monitoring and some of the data that has been produced here. Um, I think I mentioned you before. What stands out to me looking at this is I'm seeing your two maps to the right, where you see a high concentration of PM 2.5 measurement in the US, and it seems like equally consistent level in Europe. And when we talk about NO2, we see this large presence of monitoring NO2 in Europe and very little in the US. So, I mean, that stands out to me on the graph. Are there specific reasons for that?
Yeah. I will say this is a slightly older graph, so
Okay.
this will change because there's been a couple of things that are not being fed into OpenAQ anymore. Um, but that's neither here nor there. I think part of this is density, right? The If you look at the NO2 graph, where we have monitors in the US, pretty much every population center is going to have a few at the minimum, right? And you look at LA to San Francisco, there's an absolute ton of them, obviously.
Yes.
Um, and then along like the Northeast corridor, right? An absolute ton of them. And obviously, population weighted, that is a lot of the US. Um,
Oh, that's a good point. Yes, I understand.
yeah. And then, so you look at um, Europe, right? And there's going to be a similar amount in sort of that population weight. But there is also there are a couple other parts of this in that one, we have to be cognizant of the sources that are being fed into OpenAQ. Uh, In the US, I don't think that there are many low or lower cost sensors that are being fed in for a number of various reasons. Whereas in Europe, there are more manufacturers and users who are happy to feed into this OpenAQ database for that, right? So that is something to be really aware of. I imagine if we filtered out, or we only looked at the regulatory and the reference grade monitors, the density would probably be pretty similar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Talking about global monitoring, I think this is a nice way to move into what I believe is our last slide, um, about AfroSet. And that's how you and I first became acquainted.
Mhm.
And give the audience an overview of what you're doing and or what AfroSet is doing and how they're bringing bringing air monitoring to specifically Ghana and other places throughout the world as well.
Yeah. So if we go back one slide, actually,
Yes,
this is how I always like to introduce this, is this
sure.
graph on the left, right? So on the x-axis, we have this sort of annual exposure or annual average concentrations of PM 2.5, right? And that's on the x-axis, we have the number of monitors per million people, right? So where we want to be is low annual exposure, so closer to 0 on the y, and we want to have more monitors to ensure that there's everyone's being covered, and we know at a nice high spatial resolution if there are any hotspots or not for PM 2.5, right? So we want to be
Yes,
low, and we want to be towards the right. And if you look
got it.
at the global north, right? Western Europe, North America, especially, that's where we are, right? We're low concentrations, high concentration to monitor. But if you look at Africa, or most of the global south, really, it's the opposite, right? There are
Mhm.
higher average concentrations and low number of monitors. And so this is really where um, low and lower cost sensors, of which TSI is a manufacturer of one type, uh, this is where these shine, right? It's because in the global south, the resources to move us from left to right, low number of sensors per people to high number of sensors per people, um, you have to be very like surgical and precise in how those funds are spent, right?
Yes.
So this is why we get to this idea of low cost sensors being a really crucial tool for the global south, and for lowering them from high concentrations to low average concentrations. Um, and yeah, so this is part of the reason why AfroSet was started. If we can go one slide forward, was because there's also this idea of these low and lower cost sensors being only calibrated and generally manufactured for the global north, right? And so you get this discrepancy in what these sensors are calibrated to do, which is measure or quantify the sources common in the global north and the levels of pollution common in the global north, and then applying that to different sources and different annual and average concentrations in the global south, right? And that doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one. So that's why we need AfroSet, which is the Sensor Evaluation and Training Center for West Africa, right? So basically, setting up a system and working with a bunch of other similar types of sensor evaluation centers, Air Paris in France, AQSpec in the South Coast Air Quality Management District in California, and NILU in Norway. to come together, figure out a testing schema to figure out how well these low cost sensors are performing in different parts of the world, and really making sure that people, researchers, policymakers, etc., citizen scientists in Africa have the tools and the understanding to effectively deploy low cost sensors, uh, and really monitor their pollutant exposure levels. Um, yeah, and so I think we're now in the what is this, the third year of
Yes.
AfroSat. Um, Originally set up just a couple of years ago, um, and this year they are participating in the Microsensors Challenge with Air Paris and with an organization in Thailand, right? So this is basically uh, a competition, right? It's an evaluation protocol where you have identical sensors set up in France, Ghana, and Thailand, all being turned on at the same time, measured for the same length of time, having the same data processing protocols applied, and then really evaluating, okay, how are these sensors performing in um, the global north in France? How are they in West Africa, which has a very unique set of meteorological conditions, being right next to the Sahara Desert, and how are they performing in a tropical area like Bangkok? Is TSI participating in this year?
I'm not aware unless they're using, I know that TSI sensors are at AfroSat, so if they're
Mhm.
using those sensors to collect that data, potentially yes.
Okay, it doesn't start for a while, so um, I encourage anyone on this call to really to look into this and encourage everyone to take part in this, because it's an interesting competition, and actually um, I think India might also be in part of this year.
Okay,
I haven't been on these conversations because I've moved on from this previous position, but I think I might actually have missed one here. So
great. I believe we have a question. Thank you for that overview. And I noticed that AfroSat and University of Ghana has a big presence on social media, LinkedIn, to follow that. Allison is always putting out great content, so I do recommend following that. So I have a question here. I'm wondering if these low-cost sensors can be used to monitor air quality in clean cities compared to pollutant cities. Also, can we use these sensors for policy research?
you
Um,
want to you want to take the first crack at that?
I mean, yes, I believe yes, they can be used to monitor both in different environments. Yes, so most definitely you can. Mike, your
Yeah, I agree with that. And then the second part of the question is really based on like your local conditions, where you are, what the laws are concerning it. Um, so I'll say in the US, right? Generally speaking, low cost sensor data will not be used for policy, right? Um, there's a specific like hierarchy of data and hierarchy of instruments, um, and low cost sensors are basically used for figuring out if a higher cost reference monitor needs to be deployed somewhere, or uh, in certain cases, like early alert systems for things like wildfire, smoke plumes, and that kind of thing. Um, France, and I think the EU in general, is now starting a like kind of certificate program
Mhm.
where they will test low cost sensors. And basically, if you pass the tests, you can be used for other types of data as well. Or the data from these sensors can be used for other types of applications beyond that. Um, I'm not sure if it's quite up to regulatory measurement standards or not, but you can look into that.
Mike, would that
Um,
process be similar to what they're doing at AQ Spec or even what you've done at Afraset? Go
it's
through testing, gathering
it's
data.
similar. It's similar. There is a price tag associated with it. um, because I'm not going to say it's more or less rigorous. I will say it's similar, but yeah.
Okay.
Um, so I think the the short answer is like there are definitely cases where you can make an argument that low cost sensor data should be used for policymakers and um, used for policy, but that's not the case everywhere.
That's great. And again, just to reiterate the first part of the question, yes, low cost sensors are used in cities and rural areas. We have Blue Skies devices, TSI Blue Sky devices deployed globally in major cities throughout the U.S. And throughout the world as well. Thank you all for. I think that wraps it up, Mike. This was fantastic. I think we all appreciate the level of data that you went through, the explaining the process, and I feel I have a much better understanding of what actually is going on um, during a pre and post fire, and I think it's just helpful to continue to educate to allow us all to make better decisions or the right decisions. Uh, in both preventative way and during that process as well. Um, Mike, can be you are you permanently at UC Berkeley at this point now?
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay,
And my email is just Mike Giordano, my name at berkeley.edu. If anyone ever wants to
great.
email me.
And I'm sure, and if someone wanted to find you, find your department, they can go to UC Berkeley's website.
Yep. Yep. There we go. Alicia put it in the chat. So if anyone wants to email
Yes,
me.
and I can be reached. I focus on um, low cost sensors at air continuous monitoring sensors at TSI. So if there's any questions, any follow up, any information, any literature, please feel free to contact me. And I look forward to hearing feedback and thank you all for participating and attending our conference.
Thanks so much.
Mike, thank you. Have a great afternoon. Thank you all.
Bye.